All right, so we're doing a deep dive today, and we're talking about domestic workers in Saudi Arabia.
Big topic.
It is a big topic, and we've got some great sources from SaudiHires.com.
Yeah, they've got a lot of information there.
Yeah, they've got like the whole Saudi labor law, which we could spend a whole deep dive on.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But we're not doing that today. We're talking about domestic workers who have their own regulations.
A whole separate set.
And a whole separate set of regs. So we're going to be looking at those today. Those are from 2023, actually. And we're going to be looking at what's in those regulations, what's important for you if you're maybe thinking about hiring a domestic worker or if you are a domestic worker yourself.
Yeah, it's a really important topic. And I think a lot of people don't realize how much goes into this.
No, they don't. And it's good that SaudiHires is making this information so accessible because it is really important to understand these rules.
Absolutely. So where should we start?
Well, I think a good place to start is with like the basics. What exactly do we mean by domestic worker in this context?
Right. Well, the 2023 regulations actually have a very specific definition, and it's anyone who is providing personal services in your home, directly or indirectly, like for your family, under your supervision in exchange for wages.
Okay, so we're talking about like the obvious ones, housekeepers, nannies.
Right, but it's broader than that.
Okay, so who else is included in this?
It could be gardeners, private drivers, even security for your house.
So really anyone who is providing a service within the home.
Yeah, and they have to be at least 21 years old to be a domestic worker in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, that's an interesting detail. I didn't realize there was an age requirement.
Yeah, no teenage babysitters, I guess.
Right, that makes sense, though, when you think about the responsibilities involved.
Absolutely. And speaking of responsibility, we should probably talk about contracts because SaudiHires really emphasizes how important they are in this whole system.
Yeah, they do. And they even break down like all the essential elements that need to be included in Article 8 of the regulations.
Right, like names, nationalities, the type of work, wages, payment method, vacation time.
It's a pretty comprehensive list.
Yeah.
Seems like they've thought of everything.
They really have. And one thing I want to add is that even though unwritten agreements are valid, according to Article 7, it's always best to have a written contract.
Right. It protects both you and the worker.
Exactly. It's like a safety net for everyone.
Okay. So you've got your contract all sorted out. What happens next?
Well, there's a probationary
A
period.
probationary period?
Yeah.
Like for a regular job?
Yeah, exactly. It can be up to 3 months.
3 months.
Wow.
That seems kind of long to be on trial for your job.
It can be, but it gives both the employer and the worker a chance to make sure it's a good fit.
I guess that makes sense.
Like imagine you hire someone and then you realize they're allergic to your cat or they hate cleaning the bathroom.
Or maybe they thought they would love taking care of kids, but then they realize they actually don't.
Exactly. The probationary period gives everyone an out if it's not working out.
Right. But of course, you can't just like kick someone out on the street, even during the probationary period.
Of course not. They're still entitled to proper notice and payment for the days they've worked.
It's not a free pass to treat people badly.
Definitely not.
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked about probationary periods. Let's move on to work hours and time off.
Okay. This is where it gets interesting.
Yeah, the regulations say that domestic workers can work a maximum of 10 hours per day, but then there are all these like complicated rules about rest breaks.
Like, how does that work?
It's all broken up, half an hour here, half an hour there, but they can't work for more than 5 hours straight without a break.
Okay, and what about a full day off? Do they get at least 1 day off per week?
They get 24 consecutive hours off per week.
So 1 day off after working 10 hours a day, 6 days a week.
Yes.
That doesn't seem like a lot of time to rest and recharge.
No, it doesn't. It definitely raises questions about work-life balance.
Right, and what about vacation time?
Okay, so for vacation time, they earn 1 month of paid vacation for every 2 years they work.
2 years for 1 month.
Yeah.
That seems like a long time to wait for a vacation, especially when you consider that they're away from their families and support systems.
It is, and there's also the possibility that the employer can just pay the worker instead of giving them the actual time off.
So they could potentially work for years without a proper break.
It's possible. That's one of the areas where the regulations could be improved.
Yeah, it doesn't seem very fair.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the not-so-great stuff. Let's talk about workers' rights. What kind of protections do domestic workers have in Saudi Arabia?
Well, Article 15 lays out a number of important rights.
Oh, like what?
For example, the employer has to cover all the recruitment and visa fees. They can't hold on to the worker's passport or other personal documents. And of course, physical or verbal abuse is strictly prohibited.
That's good to know. It's reassuring to know that there are safeguards in place to prevent exploitation.
And on the flip side, Article 16 outlines the worker's responsibilities.
Right. So every right comes with responsibilities. What are some of the things that domestic workers are expected to do?
Well, they have to do their job. Well, obviously follow instructions, treat the employer and their family with respect.
Okay, that all seems pretty standard.
Right. But there are some other things that are interesting, like they're expected to respect Saudi customs and traditions.
That makes sense given the cultural context.
And they're not allowed to work for anyone else or even do any freelance work while they're under contract.
So they're really bound to that one employer.
Pretty much. And they also have to maintain the confidentiality of the employer's household.
Confidentiality. That's a broad term. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it could definitely lead to misunderstandings.
It seems like clear communication and boundaries are super important in this type of relationship.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about responsibilities. Let's get to the part that everyone's really interested in getting paid.
Yes, show me the money. How does that work?
Article 17 is very clear. Wages have to be paid in Saudi riyals each month.
So no funny business with foreign currencies.
Nope. And SaudiHires actually has a really handy gratuity calculator that takes all the legal stuff into account.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, it's a great resource. So yeah, wages are paid monthly, but what about if a worker misses work?
Do they still get paid?
Article 19 covers that. If they're absent without a valid reason, then no, they don't get paid for those days.
Makes sense. But what if it's the employer who prevents them from working? Like if they say, oh, I don't need your help today, but the worker is ready and willing.
In that case, the worker is still entitled to their pay, even if they haven't actually done any work.
It's interesting how they've thought of all these different scenarios.
They've tried to cover all the bases. And what about deductions from wages?
Are there any situations where that's allowed?
Article 20 gets into that. Deductions are only allowed in very specific circumstances, and they can't be more than 25% of the worker's wage.
So they can't just dock your pay for being late or for breaking a dish.
Right. It has to be something serious, like if the worker intentionally causes damage or if there's a court order or something.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot here. Definitions, contracts, probation work hours, time off, rights, responsibilities, wages. It's a pretty comprehensive system.
It is. And we've only just scratched the surface.
I know. There's so much more to unpack, but I think we'll have to save that for part 2 of our deep dive.
Sounds good. Okay, so last time we were talking about all the ins and outs of wages for domestic workers in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, a lot to cover there.
It is, and there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to these regulations.
Right, like what happens when the contract ends?
Well, that's actually a good place to pick up because, we often think of contracts as just having a fixed end date, right?
Yeah, you sign a contract for 2 years, whatever, and then it just expires.
Right. But with domestic workers, it's not always so straightforward.
Oh, really? So there are other ways that a contract can be terminated.
Yeah, there are Article 21 of the regulations lists all the different possibilities.
Okay, let's hear them. What are some of the ways that a contract can end?
Well, it can be as simple as both parties agreeing to end it. Maybe they both decide it's not working out and they part ways amicably.
Okay, so a mutual agreement.
Right. Or it could be due to something unforeseen, like if the employer or the worker dies or becomes incapacitated.
Wow, I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, life happens.
Yeah.
And then there are things like force majeure events, natural disasters, political upheavals, anything that makes it impossible to fulfill the contract.
Right. Those are the big act of God situations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's one more that's kind of interesting. If the worker reaches the age of 60, that can also be grounds for termination.
Oh, wow. So it's like a built-in retirement age for domestic workers.
Yeah, kind of. And then, of course, if the contract is terminated, there are rules about how the final pay is handled and any outstanding debts are settled.
That's in Article 23, right?
Yep. Article 23 covers all of that. But let's be real, the thing that most workers are probably most concerned about is the end of service gratuity.
Yeah, that's the big payout that they've been working towards.
Exactly. It's their reward for years of service. And all the details about that are in Article 22.
Okay, spill it. How is the gratuity calculated?
It's actually pretty straightforward. For every 4 consecutive years that they've worked, they're entitled to 1 month's worth of their wage as gratuity.
Oh, okay. So it's like a month's salary for every 4 years worked.
Exactly. And they get it on the last day of their contracts.
Not bad. Not bad at all.
It's a way to acknowledge their contribution and help them transition to whatever comes next.
Right, because they're often sending money back home to their families or saving up to start their own businesses or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's an important part of their financial security. But there are some situations where a worker might not be entitled to the full gratuity.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Article 26 lists all the grounds for termination without gratuity, and some of them are pretty serious.
Okay, like what kind of serious stuff are we talking about?
Well, if the worker seriously breaches their contract, like refusing to work or stealing from the employer.
Okay, so those are like major violations.
What? Yeah, or if they assault the employer or their family, or if they disappear from work.
Oh, wow. So there are some pretty clear lines drawn there.
There are. But it's not just about employers having the upper hand. There are also situations where a worker can terminate the contract and still get paid.
Really? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, Article 27 covers that. So if the employer is the one who breaches the contract.
Like if they're not paying the agreed upon wages or if they're abusive or something.
Exactly. Then the worker can terminate the contract and still demand their unpaid wages and even the gratuity.
So they're protected even if they're the ones who decide to leave.
Right. It gives them some power in the relationship.
I like that. It's good to know that these regulations are looking out for the workers.
They are. And, SaudiHires.com has a lot of really helpful information about all of this on their website.
They do. They've got articles that break down these complex topics, and they even have contact information for labor offices if a worker needs help.
It's a great resource for both employers and employees.
Okay, so we've talked about how contracts can end and what happens with gratuity. But what happens when someone breaks the rules? What are the consequences?
Well, there are penalties in place for both employers and workers who violate the regulations.
Like fines or something?
Yeah, Article 29 lays out the fines for employers, and they can be pretty hefty, up to 20,000 Saudi rials.
Wow. So they're not messing around.
Nope. And they can also be banned from hiring domestic workers for up to 3 years.
Or both.
Or both. And if they're repeat offenders, they can be permanently banned from hiring domestic workers.
Ouch. That's got to sting.
Yeah, it's a serious business. And workers can also face penalties.
So it's a two-way street.
It is Article 30 lists the penalties for workers, which can include fines up to 2,000 Saudi rials and being banned from working in the kingdom.
Okay, so everyone needs to be on their best behavior.
Pretty much. But it's not all about punishment.
Right.
The money from those fines actually goes to a good cause.
Oh, really? Where does it go?
It goes into a fund that supports domestic workers in need.
Oh, wow. So it's like a safety net for workers who might be struggling.
Exactly. It's a way of making sure that the system as a whole is working to protect workers' rights.
I like that. It's nice to know that there's a positive side to all of this.
Yeah, it shows that they're not just focused on punishing people, but also on helping those who need it most.
So we've talked about the end of the contract gratuity penalties for violations. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's important to remember that this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Right. There's always more to learn and more to discuss.
Exactly. And I think the main takeaway here is that these regulations are in place for a reason.
To protect both the employer and the worker.
Exactly. It's about creating a fair and equitable system for everyone involved.
So if you're thinking about hiring a domestic worker in Saudi Arabia, or if you are a domestic worker yourself, it's important to familiarize yourself with these regulations.
Absolutely. They're there to protect you and to ensure that everyone's rights are respected.
Well said. Well, I think this has been a really informative deep dive.
I agree. I'm glad we had the chance to unpack all of this.
Me too. It's been an eye-opening experience.
And hopefully it's been helpful for our listeners as well.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, if you have any questions or if you want to learn more about this topic, be sure to check out SaudiHires.com. They have a wealth of information on their website.
And don't forget to tune in next time for another deep dive into a different topic.
Until then, stay curious